Hello there. It's October now, and that means it's Halloween season. I love Halloween. It's one of my favorite holidays, and not just for the delectable treats that always end up filling my Facebook feed. No, I love Halloween because it's kind of an excuse to get a little dark, get a little scared, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, my mom does the best witch cackle you have ever heard. She scared the crap out of me on Space Mountain the first time I ever wrote it. It's a time to get excited for the monsters and the ghost stories, and a bit of the grotesque. And let's be honest here, we humans have been fascinated by the unknown and craziness since the dawn of time. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not the biggest fan of the horror genre in general. I can really only handle it around Halloween, and I don't really go for getting scared all that much. But there is a funness to getting scared, so I'm a little on the mild side. I'm not as scared as some people, but I am certainly not going to be charging headfirst into a corn maze. No, I tend to enjoy the classic scares of Halloween, and that usually involves some movies and books. I'm talking Dracula, stuff about witches, and of course, Frankenstein. And I'm not talking about the green one with bolts in his neck. I'm talking the real Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Sorry, Boris Karloff. Now, to be honest, when I first read Frankenstein, I hated it. This was back in high school, and honestly, I can probably say that it was more to the effect that I was forced to read it as opposed to the actual meat of the story. I've always had kind of a hard time reading stuff that's been assigned to me. One of the reasons why I took so long to read a lot of things, actually. But it wasn't until I read it again in college for one of my college classes that I really decided to give it an actual chance. And I am so glad I did. It is one of the few stories that involves something so grotesque and scary that I thoroughly enjoy. It really was the first one that sparked my interest in something that was a little out of my comfort zone. Frankenstein was so original for its time, and honestly, it's still pretty original now. Back in the early 1800s, things were different, to say the least. There was definitely an emergence of scientific discovery, and a lot of that made its way into fictional writing. Now, most of the popular stuff at the time was... most of the stuff that was most popular at the time probably would have been pastoral poetry by William Wordsworth, and any sort of novels that came out at that time were typically along the lines of travel and happy endings and stuff like that. Well, maybe not happy endings all the time, but you get my point. It wasn't really going this deep. But in order to talk about Frankenstein, you have to talk about its writer, Mary Shelley. Now, Mary Shelley was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. Now, if you know anything about history and philosophy, you'll know who Mary Wollstonecraft is. She was considered the mother of feminism. A lot of her work is still studied today because she was an excellent philosopher, which brings me to Mary Shelley's father, who was William Godwin. I believe I read somewhere that he is like one of the forefathers of anarchy or something like that. And with having these two as parents, Mary Shelley definitely grew up with a bit of scandal in her background just out of the gate. You can only imagine the kind of life she grew up with having William Godwin as a father, and her mother having died shortly after her birth. So she never knew her mom, and she's raised by this anarchist father. Okay. And Mary, much like her mother, was very independent. Then Mary Shelley kind of made her own scandals. She fell in love with a man named Percy Shelley, who was married at the time, and the two actually ended up having an affair and running off together. They didn't get married until after Percy's wife committed suicide while she was pregnant, and that scenario actually supposedly had an effect on Mary herself for a very long time. So with all this scandal and deaths and stuff, they fled to Geneva, Switzerland, alongside a few of their friends. And I believe Mary's stepsister was in that group as well. Anyway, while they're in Geneva, Percy, Mary, and Lord Byron, who was a famous poet in his own right, they decided to have a little contest to see who could make the best horror story, and I know who won. Mary, without a doubt. So what resulted from this contest was, you guessed it, Frankenstein, published in 1818. The book was so well received that it got several theatrical performances, and it is widely considered to be the first sci-fi novel, the first true sci-fi novel. There is some speculation about that. You can go read that kind of stuff for yourself, but even today in classes, it is portrayed and presented as the first true sci-fi novel. Okay, so let's talk about the story itself. I'm not going to go into too much detail because you really should read it for yourself, and do not try to watch the movies because none of them compare to the book. A lot of them don't even look or sound, or there is nothing alike. Hardly any of the adaptations of Frankenstein actually do this book justice. It is something that you have to read for yourself because no film can actually get it, or at least get it right. A lot of the misconceptions about Frankenstein actually start from the Boris Karloff version in the 1950s. So I'm going to go into a few of those misconceptions and kind of get to it. First and foremost, let's talk about the name. Frankenstein actually refers to Dr. Victor Frankenstein, who is the monster's creator. A lot of people to this day still refer to the monster as Frankenstein. And if you look at costumes, you'll definitely see that continuing to this very day. Even a lot of media that portray the monster, particularly Boris Karloff's version, they all kind of refer to the monster as Frankenstein. Never in the book is the monster referred to as Frankenstein. It's always the creature, and I think it is also the monster. Dr. Frankenstein in the novel is a doctor. He's a medical doctor who is struck by grief and the loss of human life. His goal is to regain life or create life, and he is very arrogant in his pursuits. And also, going off of Victor Frankenstein, he's not actually the mad scientist.
Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
He's a doctor. He just wants to save lives, and he kind of gets a little carried away. Okay, so what about the monster? We gotta talk about this. Of course, we all know Boris Karloff's version. The green skin, the bolts in his neck, pieced together, and that's pretty much consistent, right? No. Actually, in the book, there's really no reference to electricity being what makes him alive. He's also described completely different in the book, and let me tell you, Boris Karloff is tame. He is described to be about 8 foot tall with translucent yellowish skin that is very tight and barely contains his organs and all the arteries and everything that you can see through the skin. His eyes glowing, he has extremely white teeth, and his hair is black. He is very scary, and he is very scary, and Victor Frankenstein is completely out of his wits when he does see him for the first time. But the monster isn't actually dumb. He's actually very intelligent, and he's quite the philosopher. He's actually a little simplistic in his views and ways, but that's more of a lack of human experience than it is wrong. Now let's talk about the overall themes. Most people might consider Frankenstein to be a story about not playing God.
In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God.
Which is kind of understandable. It does touch on the fact that Victor shouldn't have tried to do something like that. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And sometimes you can just leave it at that. It is definitely a part of the story. But Mary Shelley and her friends were not exactly the religious type. It's said that she was spiritual, but that's about as far as it went. The whole don't play God thing is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot to do with responsibility and nature versus nurture. Victor should take responsibility for the monster because he's the one who created him. All of the events could have been avoided if Victor had just accepted death for what it was, as being a part of life just as much as birth was being a part of life. But he didn't do that. He made a choice to not accept what death was, and he ran with it. He didn't take responsibility for the monster, and the monster, in turn, didn't take responsibility for his own actions as well. There's a big fact that if you don't face your mistakes and try to fix them, they fester and become bigger problems. And that's exactly what happened with the monster for Victor. And then, of course, there's the nature versus nurture. If Victor had gone along and tried to teach the monster how to be a human, even though he looks crazy, would the monster have turned out the way he does? The monster himself doesn't even know which way he would have gone if Victor had taken the time to raise him in a way. Shelley's Frankenstein is kind of a commentary on human society and human behavior. It's not always pretty. Now, I know I said don't watch any Frankenstein movie because it's not going to be like the book, which that is true. But the best version compared to the original story that I've seen is Robert De Niro's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from 1994. So if you are going to watch a Frankenstein movie and you want it to be as close to the book as possible, definitely check that one out because it's really, really good. It has a very intelligent monster, unlike a lot of the others, and it's pretty scary, not gonna lie. And the monster is pretty grotesque. As always, thank you so much for watching today. I'm so excited for Halloween that all of the blogs and videos this month will have to do with myths and legends and spooky things that I find enjoyable, and I hope you do too. If you're interested in reading a little bit of a creepy horror story, you can check out my website, audrabwilson.com, and go to Works. You'll find The Shadow in the short stories. There will also be another short story up sometime this month, but you can check out the news tab on audrabwilson.com to figure out when that will come out. You can also sign up for my newsletter. It comes out monthly, and you'll get insider information. Soon there will be some more perks to go along with the newsletter. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter. I always post when my blogs and vlogs are up, but I have been kind of avoiding those two for the fact that it's an election year and it's getting really close to election time, so I don't really go on there as much as I used to. That should clear up closer to the end of the year once the election is over. But you can still check out my Twitter and Facebook and see my past blogs and videos for your viewing pleasure. Have a delectably spooky Halloween season. Until next time.